Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Chuck's brother wants us to answer 7 questions and he'll believe in God. Are we up to the task, Pat?
I sure hope so, my friend. Cheers.
Cheers. Yes, welcome everyone to Polypat Session 2. I'm Eric Robinson from Polycarp's Paradigm.
And I'm Pat Flynn from The Pat Flynn Show. And what a joy this is, Eric. I have to say, having an enthusiastic co-host podcasting is fun, kind of, when you're by yourself, but it's just so much more interesting when you have a face to look at and somebody to actually talk to. So this is very cool.
For sure. And it's kind of funny that we've been podcasting, like our first episode we recorded was like last May, and we have yet to see each other's faces until today. So we're recording this on video as well, which I'm excited about, and we'll see.
And I am not disappointed, my friend.
Yeah, wow, thanks.
I like a very minimalist setup in the background, too.
Yes. Well, I am about to move to Colorado, so I have the mess on the floor, so it's pretty clear behind me.
Yeah, just like how you can't see my pajama pants right now. It
looks
looks like I'm fully dressed, but we've all got our little secrets, I suppose.
Yes. Well, I want to give our listeners just a brief background on my friend Chuck Hood. So it's kind of funny. I don't even know if I shared this with you, Pat, but it was last summer. I was actually studying at a pond near my house in the Woodlands, and at this pond,
that sounds like Walden. I love everything about studying in a pond in the Woodlands.
It was very peaceful. It was. Yes, it was indeed. But yeah, I was studying actually Theology of the Body by St. John Paul II. And I had this big book with me, and I was on this bench. And all of a sudden, this guy I see come up to the bench, put his hands on the bench, and turn to me and say, "Hey, do you think we value human life too much in our society?" And I was like, no, I actually think we value it too little. And thus begin my relationship with Chuck.
I love it. Don't you love that when somebody just comes and just clubs you over the head with like a deep philosophical question out of nowhere in the Woodlands?
Right. It's so great. And then finally we introduced ourselves, and he's like, "Hey, I'm Chuck," and he's I think about 83 years old and very fit guy. Like, you would not guess that he's 83.
Good for him.
Yeah, we started having conversations. He grew up as a Lutheran, but then a few years ago, due to some tragedy in his life, really just lost faith in God.
Right.
And so we had some interesting conversations. And then fast forward a few months to, I guess it was like last November, he was like, "Hey, I have a brother named Robert." And Robert, he grew up Lutheran as well, but then he became Mormon. This is my understanding of it as I remember. He became Mormon, and his children became Mormon. But then also a few years ago, he actually just left that faith and became agnostic. And so Chuck told me, "Hey, my brother Robert says, if you can answer these 7 questions, he'll believe in God again." But
Deal.
Here's how Robert put it. Eric gets a jar of hot sauce if he can answer any of these questions without relying on faith or the authority of a holy book or prophet.
Fair enough.
So I was like, all right, challenge accepted, Chuck. And we will see how we can do. And I'm so thankful that I became friends with you, Pat, because you come from such a strong philosophical, reason-based mindset. And so I think that jar of hot sauce at the end of the day is going to belong to you. And that's okay with me. I think as long as we answer these questions,
Well, we'll share it when you come out to Wisconsin. We'll indulge.
That's perfect.
Get some good corn chips or whatever. Let me just say, how much I appreciate this. Both I appreciate anybody who is curious, skeptical, but still interested in having these conversations. We're all truth seekers. At least I think we all want to be, and we all should be, right? There's that natural bent of the mind to want to seek truth. So, say you grow up in some type of religious setting, and it just seems like you have good reasons to reject that. And maybe part of that is because it was of misunderstandings of whatever that religion is, or maybe there really is something wrong with that particular religious belief in and of itself. So I just want to say that I appreciate, anybody who's willing to engage in this, no matter where they're coming from. And, from my background, like you said, I was somebody who abandoned faith as well at a relatively young age, when I first originally thought that, maybe it was just kind of stupid, and that these questions couldn't be answered. So I went through a deep period of skepticism, that developed into sort of a full philosophical atheism. And then that itself collapsed, as we talked about on your show previously. And I originally came back to religion by realizing, this is the only worldview that can really coherently and consistently answer the biggest questions of life, like meaning, morality, identity, destiny, origin, things like that. And what I eventually came to realize is that, there's certain things we come to know through divine revelation and through faith, but those things go above reason. They're not below reason. So reason can take you to a very far point, as I think we'll discuss in this episode. Through reason, we can know that God exists. We can know that a general monotheism is true. But I don't think this is debated among philosophers, but I would say I don't think that you can give a philosophical argument from scratch for the Trinity, for example. I don't think you can. I think that's something that we have to have reason to take on faith. And that's another thing I want to emphasize. Anything that certainly Catholics take on faith, we take it on faith because we think we have good reason to take it on faith. Yeah. We think that we have good reason to believe that God exists, that he definitively broke into human history, philosophical reasons, historical reasons, and that because he's God and he's trustworthy, it would kind of be foolish not to accept what he reveals, about himself or his relationship to us. So even in that sense, when we talk about faith as Catholics, it's not something that's below reason. It's something that sort of super adds to reason or goes over and above reason. And these were discoveries that I made. And I hope that this is maybe just sort of a general, perhaps, perspective or lens to maybe take into this conversation.
Yes. And just before we get going, I'd like to just list off the 7 questions. And then there is a bonus question that is kind of fun that we'll reveal at the end of the episode. So you guys got to stick with us. So you get to the bonus question.
Groovy.
But here are the 7 questions. Number 1, is there a God? If so, how did he come to be? Number 2, does the Big Bang explain the creation of the universe? And what caused it, God or some other mechanism? Number 3, does Darwinian evolution explain the existence of all plants and animals, including man? Or is man a special creature? Number 4, is human consciousness a creation of the brain, or is it separate and apart from the brain? Number 5, is there a spiritual reality to our existence, or does the material physical alone explain our ultimate reality? Number 6, what happens after we die? Is it eternal annihilation? We just no longer exist? Or do we continue to exist in some form, spiritual or consciousness? And number 7, what will be the end of the universe? Eternal expansion to nothingness? So we got our work cut out for us today, Pat.
Yeah, and again, I just want to emphasize how much I appreciate this. These are good questions.
Yes.
They're good questions. They're questions I think that all of us have at some point or other, maybe not in this exact form, but they also seem to me very sincere questions, right? And I think that that's important when we're having these dialogues, especially with people who aren't, coming from the same beliefs or perspectives, is that, when I read these questions, I thought, wow, these are really good questions. And they're sincere. Like there's nothing, insulting or condescending about them, right? As you might read in like a Reddit forum or a YouTube comment section. There's nothing about, oh, you guys are silly, you believe in some guy with a beard in the sky. It's none of that. So, and like you handle those types of, because you handle that in a different way, because that's a different type of objection. What I'm emphasizing here is this just seems very sincere, and I appreciate that. Yes. And I want to be patient with this, and I want to take our time, because I think that these are good questions and they deserve a good response. Even if we can't cover everything, maybe at least give some general direction and further resources. And
I think what's great too is to prepare for this, we actually both answer these questions in written form. My answers were very brief and short, and not as sophisticated as Pat Flynn's. But Pat answered these questions pretty in depth and very well, I thought. And so we plan on putting this on our websites. I will try to do that. Remind me, Pat, to do that on mine. And my website is polycarpsparadigm.com. So I'm going to try to upload this at some point so y'all can see the full thing if you want to get like the in-depth stuff.
Right.
And if you want to share your website and then, yeah.
Yeah, so mine will be chroniclesofstrength.com, and same thing. I'll either put the written responses, which will have more detail than probably what we'll cover in this episode, just for sake of time constraints. I'll either PDF it so you can download it or put it right there for anybody who wants to go a little bit deeper.
You know, I kind of want to begin real quick, actually, with a brief quote from St. John Paul II.
Groovy. It sounds good.
Fides et ratio, faith and reason. This is the opening line, and I just love it. And this will kind of get us going in this. Faith and reason are like two wings on which the human spirit rises to the contemplation of truth. And God has placed in the human heart a desire to know the truth, in a word, to know himself, so that by knowing and loving God, men and women may also come to the fullness of truth about themselves.
Amen to that.
Whoa. All right, Pat.
It doesn't sound like just like that. Just doesn't sound like just stupid. Don't question things, right? And
right.
That's what was so attractive to me about the Catholic faith, Eric, was like I would read things like this, and I would read the Catholic theologians and philosophers. Like these guys not only were extremely intelligent, they took questioning seriously. They took the intellectual disciplines extremely seriously.
Yeah.
Philosophy, theology, science, all of that. And I found that extremely attractive. Attractive. And it seems appropriate as well. Like we are rational animals. And if we believe that God created us, which I certainly do, he created us with intellect and will. Why would he create us with intellect and rationality if he didn't want us to use it?
Right.
It just doesn't seem to make sense, right?
Exactly.
Made this in a very pointless way. So yeah, it's for me, it has to be a both and. It has to be faith.
Exactly.
So good. I'm glad we started there.
All right. Well, question number 1: is there a God? If so, how did he come to be? Pat,
yes.
What do you say about this?
I certainly think so, and I think that we can come to God's existence in a certain and definitive way through natural theology and metaphysics. And natural theology and metaphysics is just really philosophical arguments for God, thinking really hard, typically from some basic fact of experience or some general explanatory principle, and then abstracting some other perhaps metaphysical principle from that fact of experience, driving it through to some necessary logical conclusion that ultimately lands you at some necessarily existing eternal source of everything else that exists, right? And most people would call that God. Or you take some general explanatory principle and you can realize that when you apply this principle consistently, it also gets you to God. And what I've realized in my study, before we get into the argument specifically of natural theology, is I think there's kind of a true dilemma that's presented when you really appreciate arguments for the existence of God. And I think that true dilemma is something like this. If you admit that reason has any power whatsoever, and you're consistent with it, you're ineluctably going to get to God's existence. And we can give a little sketch there of why that is in a minute. And the only other alternative seems to me to be a radical and self-refuting skepticism. So to affirm reason at all is going to cause God to kind of pop up on that intellectual radar, at least eventually, if you're willing to push it far enough. And to want to avoid God, you're going to have to undercut certain principles that will just take down the entire enterprise of human rationality itself. I would make that claim. I would. So, and the reason I would make that claim is, one, I think it's true. And two, is it just goes to show how rational and reasonable and responsible belief in God is. So if you want, Eric, we can just kind of maybe give a general quick sketch of one approach.
Yes, for sure.
If you're down for it.
Yeah.
Okay, so one way that we can start is just take some type of general explanatory principle. So the one I have in this document here, and there's many more in-depth, more technical metaphysical arguments for God. And I've done an entire series on my podcast, so I'll just refer people to that. Just look for my series on natural theology. We go through Aquinas's arguments of active potency distinctions, arguments from composition, arguments from contingency, and maybe we could give a highlight of all of those here. But let's start with this one, where we take some general explanatory principle, call it the modest principle of sufficient reason, which really just says that there is a sufficient explanation for any finite limited thing, really any natural fact. And then all we need to do is ask the first question, okay, well, why should we believe this principle, right? Like, why should we think that this principle is true? And there's a couple, I think, good pieces of evidence that support it, and I think there's really one good argument of why we can't deny it. So first off is that all of science and philosophy depends on something like the modest principle of sufficient reason, right? Scientists, philosophers, we're on the hunt for explanations, right? We assume in science that there's sort of an etiological map, that one physical event has an explanation in terms of some prior or maybe even concurrent physical event as well, that there's a way that we can make sense of the unfolding of physical events. And that's largely what science deals with. It's in the etiological domain. Philosophy is more ontological. It asks questions of like, well, why are there any physical events at all? So I would say that anybody who wants to affirm that there's validity in science and philosophy is going to be committed, at least implicitly, to something like this modest principle of sufficient reason. Secondly, it's obvious, it's common sense, and there's no experience to the contrary. Or even when there seems like there's experience to the contrary, we don't think that that's a serious objection to the principle. So I'll give you an example. We find a dead body, right? And we think that this person is murdered. But we don't know who the murderer was, right? But we don't think, oh, it's just a brute fact. There's no explanation, right? It's just a dead body. No, what we think is, no, there's definitely an explanation to this, right? We just don't seem to have all the evidence to know what that explanation is. So I mean, just imagine what you might be committed to if you were to deny this type of principle. You come across some murder scene, like, oh, no explanation needed because everybody knows that the principle of sufficient reason isn't true. People would laugh at you, right? This is insane, right? But I think we can go even stronger. And I think we can say that you can't even coherently deny this principle, because as soon as you do, it lands you in a sort of radical and self-refuting skepticism. So, for example, if you think that things can just happen with no explanation, no sufficient explanation for their existence, well, then it seems like this could apply to all of our beliefs and cognitive states. Rather than believing the things I do because I have good reasons to believe them, right, through experience, or what have you, or reasoning processes. Perhaps I believe what I do and think the things that I do and have the cognitive states that I have for no reason whatsoever. They're just there. They're not causally connected or brought into existence by anything. Well, then it seems like I should be dubious of all my beliefs, all my cognitive states, including the belief and cognitive state that the principle of sufficient reason isn't true. So to even have the belief that something like this principle isn't true seems like it would immediately undermine any reason you could have for doubting the belief.
Right.
And the point of showing this is like, I think we can say that this is a bedrock principle. Like you cannot coherently deny this. So not only do we have all the experience, all the commitment to science and philosophy, but it just doesn't seem like this is something that can be coherently denied without landing into a global radical skepticism.
Yeah, one thing I love when you shared your story on my podcast was you equated that sort of like, if you deny that, you're basically doing what a lot of atheists accuse people of faith doing, which is you're just having blind faith.
Right.
Like that's just blind faith then, of like, you just think that things just like popped out of nowhere. Like, I mean, without any explanation, like,
or that the things that do have explanations, it's just a miracle that they have an explanation.
Yeah, a miracle.
Right? It's just a miracle, right? No, and it seems like unless we just want to make everything that has an explanation just a miracle, well, it just seems like the reason they have explanations is because something like the principle of sufficient reason is true, right?
Right.
And the reason I say something like is there's different versions of the principle of sufficient reason, and some I think are probably a little too strong. So that's why I say just a modest principle of sufficient reason is all we need for
this. We're being modest here, everyone.
Yeah. All right. Well, then once you have that, it's kind of a pretty simple, work from there to get to God. Because then if every finite limited thing has an explanation, eventually we're going to need to explain all finite limited things or the collection of them. And you can't explain X in terms of X. We can't explain limits in terms of further limits. So we have to get to something that is qualitatively unlimited, unrestricted, qualitatively infinite. And for that, most people would immediately start to think, oh, well, that sounds pretty much like God. But we can unpack that further and show, yes, that this is God for a couple of reasons. One is whatever is infinite and unlimited, there can only be one of these things, right? And we can see this through a couple different paths, but here's an easy one, right? In order for there to be, say, two qualitatively infinite and unlimited beings, there would have to be some sort of differentiating feature between them. One of these things would have to lack something the other has, for example. But then it would have to be limited in some way. It would have to be restricted in some way. It would have to be somewhere the other one isn't. It would have to know something the other one doesn't. It would have to be able to do something the other one can't. And then we're just back to finitude. And that's what we mean by finitude and restriction, right? That things exist, but they only exist in a certain degree or a certain intensity. They exist here rather than there, or at this time rather than that time, or with these powers rather than those powers, with this constitution rather than that. Think of any type of finitude or restriction you want. That's what we mean by that. And when we get to a qualitatively unlimited and infinite being, we don't mean like an infinite spatial magnitude. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about being as such with no restrictions or limits on what it is, what it knows, what it can do. And we can see there can only possibly be one such being. So this is a general sketch, of course, but this shows how reason can get you to a very robust monotheism, right? To a being that has no lacks, no privations, no wrinkles, no defects. It has to be qualitatively unlimited and therefore perfect, right? There's no further ends that this being, really being itself with a capital B, could possibly attain or achieve. And is that exactly what the Christian God is? No, there's extra content, I would say, that the Christians believe about God, but it's certainly on the way to the Christian God, and it's completely compatible with it. Mm-hmm. I think this is a good example where reason can take you to a certain point where it then might become additionally reasonable to accept extra things on top of it. But also reason eliminates choices too. So by getting to, say, monotheism through reason, we can be pretty sure that any religion that is committed to pantheism or polytheism or things like that, they might have some true things in them, but they can't in and of themselves be the true religion if there is a true religion. So
even to say something like his second part of that question, if there is a God, then how did he come to be, doesn't really make much sense because he always was, because he's unlimited.
Right. So what we get to is a necessarily existing being, something which, again, is not conditioned or limited or bound or restriction by time or space. Mm-hmm. What we get from that is a being that is necessarily immaterial and eternal, and whatever is eternal never came into existence, never goes out of existence.
Yeah.
And there's other ways we can get to necessity as well. So, for example, here's another kind of thought experiment. I go a little bit more detail in the document, but let's just get the general sketch out. Right. So if we just think, okay, there's clearly caused realities, right? I think most people would admit that in an experience there's caused or at least conditioned realities. There's things that exist, mm-hmm. but they only exist because certain conditions were fulfilled which enable them to be. So take us, for example. Like, I exist only because my parents met, thankfully, but so that's kind of like explaining my history of how I came into existence, but I still only exist here now because other certain conditions are met which enable me to continue in existence, whether we're talking about electromagnetic fields, the Earth's atmosphere, you name it, right? There's this sort of cobweb of different conditions that are being concurrently fulfilled which enable me to exist. And if you were to kind of kick out any of those conditions, either I'd be severely injured or I would just cease to exist. So I'm a contingent reality. I'm a cause. I'm a conditioned reality. And then we can just ask a simple question and kind of provoke a thought experiment. Could everything in reality be collectively a caused reality or conditioned reality? Meaning, could everything in reality be dependent upon the fulfillment of conditions beyond itself in order to exist? And it seems we can be absolutely certain that that can't be the case. Because if reality collectively were dependent upon something beyond itself in order to exist, but reality is just everything that existed or once existed, there's nothing beyond that, right? Mm-hmm. Because then we're talking about nothing, right? Reality is just a collection of everything that is or once was. So there can't be anything beyond everything that could have fulfilled those conditions. Now, this is like a startling thing, too, because most of everything we experience is contingent. It's conditioned. But we can know through reason that everything can't have a cause. Because if everything had a cause, then everything would be awaiting the fulfillment of conditions beyond itself to come into existence. But there's nothing beyond everything that could have fulfilled those conditions, right? It's absurd. So what we're saying is if everything were a conditioned reality collectively, then those fulfillment, then the sort of conditions for fulfillment would never have been able to be fulfilled, and nothing would ever have come to exist. We'd be committed to the absurdity that nothing exists. But things do exist. Clearly, as sure as anything, at least something exists. At least I exist, right? And so what this shows is there has to be some aspect of reality, some layer of reality, some foundation of reality that exists in virtue of what it is, that has existence in the strongest and most robust form that we can possibly conceive, really that has necessary existence, that exists in virtue of the kind of thing that it is, and is unconditioned. It doesn't require the fulfillment of conditions external to itself in order to exist. And we need to affirm that in order to avoid the absurdity that nothing came to exist. So that's a way to get to a necessary reality. And then we can just kind of hammer away at that philosophically and just unpack, well, what the heck could this thing possibly be, right? And then and then if you do that project, you'll just get back to, again, a qualitatively infinite, unlimited being. And what's cool about these types of arguments is you can take different paths. You can take different starting points, and you consistently get to the same conclusions. And you see this through the history of philosophy, of many philosophers taking different starting points, like Neoplatonic starting points from composition, Aristotelian starting points from act and potency, starting points from teleology, starting points from general explanatory principles like the PSR, just starting points from sheer contingency like we're doing, and they all converge upon the same conclusion of some eternal, necessarily existing, qualitatively perfect and unlimited being. And I think most any honest person will admit, oh yeah, that sounds pretty much like God.
Yeah. I think what's interesting, I love that second sketch too, because what I had in my mind too is like, okay, could someone make the argument that, like, I don't know, I have in my mind like two creatures that look like they're finite, but they just give life to one another, and they just do that perpetually. And so they just are always existing. I don't know what I'm, it's hard to say.
What you're trying to get at is the objection from circular causality. Could A fulfill the conditions of B, and then B fulfill the conditions of A?
Yes.
And what you'll see is that is also absurd. You would need something outside of that series to first bring that series into existence, because either that series is infinite, right? Like A, B, A, B. And if you have an infinite series of, I'll try and make this as simple as I can because it gets a little bit technical, right? So let's just say that somebody says, well, couldn't something be just, couldn't contingent realities just go like infinitely into the past or infinitely down through the chain of being? Like, wouldn't that help us to avoid a necessary reality? But we can see, no, actually, we'll land at the same absurd result. And here's why, right? If we're saying that something is dependent on its existence for, upon some infinite series of contingent realities, right? That A depends upon the fulfillment of conditions from thing B, B depends upon the fulfillment of conditions from thing C, that C depends upon the fulfillment of conditions from thing D, et cetera, into infinity, then what we're really saying is we're always one plus more set of conditions out of being fulfilled that could ever bring that entire series into existence. Right. So what is the infinite? The infinite means that is really the unachievable. So by positing an infinite series of conditioned realities or contingent realities, we're really saying that we've achieved the unachievable, which is a contradiction, right? Because we can always be one plus more move out of conditions that needs to be fulfilled in order to bring the entire series into existence. So this is an insight that philosophers have always recognized, that when we look at this type of causal series, an infinite regress leads to a contradiction. The idea that we've somehow achieved the unfulfillable achievement of conditions, right? Because we can never meet all those conditions in an infinite series, therefore nothing would ever have come to exist in the first place. And it doesn't matter how you arrange that, whether you arrange it linearly or in a circle, you hit the same problem every time. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Man. So that's getting a little more abstract and technical, awesome. but that's how to start thinking about that. But the point is, an infinite series will not save you from the conclusion, no matter what. What you could say maybe is that God, outside of that series, actualized an infinite series. That at least seems like an initial possibility. Now, some philosophers would say that even that's impossible. That an actual infinity in that sense. But that's a different thing, right? So Leibniz even gives this example. He says, even if you have an infinite series of, say, geometry textbooks, Wilhelm Gottfried Leibniz, right, the great polymath who helped, not a dummy, right? He co-discovered differential calculus. This guy was a genius in many ways. So he's one of the people who puts forward this type of contingency argument. He says, even if you have an infinite series of geometry textbooks, you still haven't explained how that infinite series got there in the first place, or why it's geometry and not biology or something else, right? So he's kind of arguing more from a principle of sufficient reason, kind of an explanatory principle. But the sketch that we just made is actually starting more. It actually proves that there has to be some type of causal feature of the world rather than assumes it. So it's different paths. And I just want to highlight that. But no matter which way you take it, you can see why an infinite series isn't going to work. No matter what, you're going to have to get to a necessary being regardless.
Yeah, and that being unlimited, because like a geometry textbook is limited to geometry, right? And so it has to be that necessarily existing being, unlimited and infinite, like you say.
Right. So if you go back to the first principle that we talked about, there's obviously certain things that are unexplained about this infinite series of geometry textbooks, right? And if you leave those things unexplained, you violate that explanatory principle. And we've already seen the cost of violating that explanatory principle, that if things could just happen for no reason, we seem to enter into this global radical skepticism. So the fact that we're trying to leave unexplained, why is it geometry? Why is a series here at all to begin with, is just to violate that modest principle of sufficient reason.
Wow. Well, are you ready to jump into question 2, or do you have more to add to question 1? Is a huge question. I mean,
it's a big one, because the who caused God objection is a very, very common thing that comes up, both in sincere ways and insincere ways. But what we're trying to show is that through reason and philosophy, we see that there has to be a necessarily existing being in order to explain why any contingent state of affairs exists at all. And we can be certain of this conclusion. And once you get that, then you're right, Eric, you hinted at it. Then it doesn't make sense to ask who caused God, because then you're just asking, well, what caused an uncaused being? And that's just a nonsensical statement, right?
Right.
Yeah. So good. Yeah, I know we dumped a lot there, but I promise it's a lot more clear in the article that we wrote. Yeah,
and I mean, I think I'll have to just re-listen to your answers and read the thing again and again, just because there's so much there, and it really makes you think. And that's why I enjoy these conversations. I'm like really thinking hard about like, okay, and trying to make sense of it myself. Right,
awesome. and be patient with this stuff. When we're doing like high level metaphysics and natural theology, and we're just scratching the surface here, right? We're just scratching the surface. Have the right expectations. We're trying to think really hard about ultimate reality. Why should that be easy?
Right. And what I found when I studied some Aquinas is it was like learning a new language, like act, potency, like what do those things mean? Like, okay, and then I had to get into the like language of it and to just even try to think these things through in metaphysics. And so it is kind of like learning a new skill or a new language that it will take time. And some people need to, like for me, I don't necessarily need to have all those reasons to believe in God. Other people like do, and that's great. Like then do the intellectual work like you were suggesting on your episode. Yeah. And
I do it because I love it. I want to understand, but you're right. A lot of people, it's not like they have to go down the entire rabbit hole of metaphysics and, construct the entire synoptic worldview, if you will. I think most people probably won't do that or won't ever want to do it. A lot of people just want or need to see that there's at least a reasonable foundation, or at least possibly a reasonable foundation. And I found in so many conversations where I kind of give some of these arguments, what impresses people the most isn't that they understand the arguments themselves. Because again, a lot of this takes work. What impresses people is that arguments can be given when they previously had no idea that arguments could be given. And I honestly, that alone, I mean, how much did that impress me too? Like when I was kind of deep in my skepticism, when I first encountered some of these traditions and arguments, it wasn't like I was convinced right away or got them right away. No, I needed to roll up my sleeves and do many years of hard work to really understand them. But I was so impressed by the fact that I was somehow naive to this tradition, right? That was pretty impressive, that I just didn't even know that this tradition existed. And that some of the most brilliant people in the history of the world were people who were behind this tradition, offering what seemed to me at least very plausible arguments. And that alone just really just put a crack in my worldview and just was like, oh, that's, if nothing else, that's interesting. Right?
And I love how it does brush up against that relativistic agnostic culture that's just like, oh, well, we can't even know anything. No, it's like we can actually know this. Like it's certain knowledge.
Well, how do you know that you can't know anything?
Exactly.
Right. Right. Like so much of skepticism, like if you just take it consistently, it just becomes immediately self-undermining, right? Well, you know at least one thing, right? So why stop there?
Yeah. That's
right?
Awesome.
Or people would say, well, you can't know anything about God. Well, you just said something that you know about God. So maybe we can know a little bit more, right?
Yes. Oh my goodness. That's so good.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, question number 2. Does the Big Bang explain the creation of the universe? And what caused it? God or some other mechanism?
Yeah, so this is really interesting because this kind of gives us a setup for another potential argument for God's existence. So science is about forming maps. I think people would just kind of get an overview of what science is, and it provides models that help us to make predictions and help us to trace histories. And science is largely etiological. We're looking at trying to understand equational relationships between physical events and how one physical event could lead to another physical event. So we can have fruitfulness of predictions, and we can maybe understand the unfolding of physical events and things like that. Extremely useful. Awesome discipline. Huge fan of the sciences. I do a lot of work in philosophy of science specifically. So modern Big Bang cosmology, that sort of general mainstream consensus here is that, yeah, this gives strong evidence of an absolute beginning to all of physical reality, that there seems to be a point some 13.8 billion years ago where all space, time, matter, and energy essentially just winked into existence. Right. And that's a really interesting thing, right? Because as I think your friend hinted at in this question is like, well, okay, that's like, what explains that? And right. And just to back up a little bit, I know, Eric, this is something you put in your response that I left out. One of the people who initially provided a set of equations for a universe that has a finite past was, of course, a Catholic priest and scientist. Father Georges Lemaitre. And he's one of the people that had to originally convince Einstein of this. And eventually Einstein came around to say that that even though he was dubious of this at first and skeptical of this, he eventually came to say this was the most beautiful theory that he had ever seen.
Wow.
Yes, and that is a true story. So far from it from Catholics being anti-science, so much in modern science is a result of brilliant Catholic scientists, not just arguably one of the most important revolutionary models in cosmology, which is the Big Bang theory. But I mean, you also look at like quantitative genetics comes from Gregor Mendel, who was a Catholic monk, for example.
Wow.
So there's so much about the sciences that the Catholic Church has contributed. It's worth appreciating and worth acknowledging. So there's that. All right. So yeah, that's the general consensus. Now, there's been other models that have been proposed, certainly, since then, that have tried to, say, rescue a past eternal universe. But really, the history of cosmology certainly in the past, since the kind of acceptance or the initial proposal of the Big Bang, has been one failed model trying to resuscitate an eternal universe after another. So physicist and cosmologist Alexander Vilenkin, who's in part responsible for the Born-Guth-Vilenkin theorem, which is a theorem that proves that any universe with an average rate of expansion has to have an absolute beginning. He's on record saying that all the evidence that we have from modern astrophysics points to the universe having an absolute beginning. Now, and that's a strong statement because he's not saying most of the evidence or the majority of the evidence. He says all of the evidence that we have points to the universe having an absolute beginning. So now it's important to understand that science in issuing, maps and models is not like the type of deductive reasoning that we were doing from first principles before. Science is always susceptible to revision. It gives us probabilities. But I think we're on really secure ground right now with the sort of Big Bang theory and the modern consensus around that. It doesn't seem like there's any good reason to doubt that. Now, if you think that is true, and if you think that things just can't come into existence from nothing and that things require a cause, then we can kind of launch into another argument for God, where we can take scientific evidence to support a premise and a philosophical argument that has a conclusion of theological significance. So I think that's important. Let me say it again. We can use scientific evidence to support a premise and a philosophical argument that has theological significance. So for example, This is a famous argument that has very ancient roots, but was sort of brought back into the mainstream by a prominent Protestant philosopher named William Lane Craig. It's called the Kalam cosmological argument. And that goes that everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. You unpack what it would have to be a cause of space, time, matter, and energy. You would necessarily have to transcend these created realities to be the creator of them, and you arrive at something very similar to what we were discussing before, some type of immaterial, qualitatively unlimited, extremely powerful, if not omnipotent, creator of the physical universe. So the Big Bang itself, from just a purely scientific standpoint, doesn't really say anything about God. I don't want to make that claim. But it gives strong evidence that we can use in a philosophical argument that seems to give a very strong conclusion of God's existence, is how I would approach it.
That's incredible. And the next question kind of goes along the same path. Number 3, does Darwinian evolution explain the existence of all plants and animals, including man, or is man a special creature?
Mm-hmm. So the first thing I want to say is I just want to diffuse what I think is a lot of unnecessary tension between religious people and the theory of evolution.
Thank you.
Let's spend some time on this. Like Catholics, you can follow the evidence wherever it leads on evolution. You're on solid ground. And I know that might not be true for some sects of Christianity that take a very, say, fundamentalist or literalist view of Genesis. But Catholics are by no means committed to that type of interpretation. And in fact, we go through the history of the church and we find that even St. Augustine, some 1,500 years before Darwin, did not interpret Genesis literally. He saw it rather than supposed to be a sort of temporal scientific modeling of the universe, which is kind of absurd to think about. Like the Bible was never meant to be a scientific textbook. That's just like kind of silly to even propose that. But he looked at it as a temporal and spiritual, a hierarchical and spiritual ordering of reality. And that's really important because it isn't like this is like theologians retreating in the face of modern science. Again, this is 1,500 years before Darwin. People have these interpretations of Genesis. So I just want to say that, again, there's, first off, between faith and reason, as Catholics, we're committed to the, I think, the obvious notion that they both ultimately come from the same source, right? So there can never be a conflict between faith and reason or faith and science, really. There might be like a superficial tension or a superficial mystery or maybe even a superficial conflict. But I think when you take the time to unpack it, you realize there's actually deep harmony between these things. And if there does seem to be some superficial tension or conflict, it's opportunity for greater growth because maybe you're misunderstanding the deposit of faith. You're getting something wrong there. Or maybe you're reasoning poorly. But either way, like, let's figure this out. Let's figure this out and grow from there. So evolution, what is the strongest evidence for evolution? I would say in my looking at it, the strongest evidence for evolution is the genetic evidence. I think that is the strongest evidence we have for the theory of evolution. Now, there's much debate, and certainly this debate is not exclusive to people who are religious and not religious as to where the evidence falls for other aspects of evolutionary theory. Whether you look at the fossil evidence or where there seems to be the most debate is in the mechanism of what drives evolution. Specifically,
when you say genetic evidence, do you mean like how our DNA is very similar, like to other creatures, or like what exactly do you mean?
Precisely that. And there's certain aspects of the genetic evidence that really that I think really run very strong support when you look at it objectively for the evolution of life forms when you're looking at it. Where I think, if you're going to just ask me personally where I think the weakest evidence is for, I think it's for the mechanism, for just the idea of selection and mutation. Mm. We have a lot of evidence right now where it just doesn't seem to have the creative capacity that a lot of people assumed. And again, this is hotly debated. And it's something that I think, and I would want to emphasize, that Catholics can be completely open to no matter what. And I want to, and I would really like to argue that every religious person, and for a couple of reasons. One is if we already have prior independent evidence and arguments for God's existence, then the question is settled, right? Like God is in some way or somehow behind the evolutionary process no matter what, just by the sheer fact that it's because of God that anything exists rather than nothing.
Right.
So if God wanted to bring life forth through the evolutionary process, that's God's prerogative. Who are we to complain, right? Like, or object. So it's not that there's a conflict between the religious worldview and evolution. The real conflict is between the religious worldview and evolution plus naturalism, where you add a philosophical layer to the theory of evolution, which is typically some form of atheism, but most particularly naturalism. And it's important to emphasize that the science says nothing of that philosophical layer whatsoever, right? That is a purely philosophical add-on. And that's what the problem is. That's what religious people should reject, and rightfully have good reasons to reject. Now, one thing that I think is helpful if you're looking for I guess, design in nature, because that's kind of where people kind of, with the evolutionary debate, it tends to get very emotional for people, which is always weird to me, these things. But what I would say is, like, look to physics, not biology, if you're looking for design, because all of evolution and biology really comes down to us living in a very, very special kind of universe. And what I highlight in these responses is that recent discoveries in astrophysics, really the past 20 to 40 years, have led to these discoveries of what's called anthropic coincidences, or the fine-tuning of certain constants and quantities right at the beginning of the universe, right at the Big Bang, that seem to be just right for the emergence of intelligent interactive life. And if any of these initial constants or quantities were off by just like a hair's breadth, like in the tiniest degree, it would be disastrous. Like, life of any kind would not even be possible. In many cases, we wouldn't even have chemistry. Sometimes the universe would just have collapsed immediately back in on itself. So it's not even like a different type of life could have evolved. No, it's like the fundamental building blocks for any possible type of life just wouldn't be here. Even atoms, for example. And we look at, say, just tunings like the mass of the electron, the initial conditions of entropy. And I have a few quotes here, Eric. Maybe it would be helpful for just to give people the impression. Let me pull this up. So here's how physicist Roger Penrose describes how finely tuned the initial conditions of entropy in the universe are. And entropy is the measure of usable energy. So to have a low entropy condition means that we have a lot of organization right at the beginning of the universe. And Roger Penrose says this. He says, in order to produce a universe resembling the one in which we live, the creator, with a capital C, he says, and I don't think he's a religious person, but he does use that term, would have to aim for an absurdly tiny volume of the phase space of possible universes, about one part in over 10 to the power of 10 to the power of 123. So to give people an idea, what he's saying there is if these conditions were altered by any more than one part in 10 to the power of 10 to the power of 123. That's a double exponent, my friends. We can't even fathom how crazy that number is, right? There's not even an example I can even think off the top of my head that would give some commensurate analogy of how incredibly improbable this is. But that's what it is. That's where we happen to land. And he's saying if we didn't have that, then nothing interesting in our universe could possibly happen, especially nothing so interesting as life. So that's something like the odds of like a monkey randomly typing the entire corpse of Shakespeare perfectly in one try is something like that. And that even kind of underplays it, right? That's how finely tuned these constants and quantities seem to be. Another quote, this one comes from physicist Paul Davies. This one's a little bit longer, but I think it's worth reading.
Yeah.
Paul Davies says, scientists are slowly waking up to an inconvenient truth. Why he says it's inconvenient, I think, just kind of reveals a sort of an interesting bias, right? Like, why is this inconvenient? The universe looks suspiciously like a fix, says Paul Davies. The issue concerns the very laws of nature themselves. For 40 years, physicists and cosmologists have been quietly collecting examples of all too convenient coincidences and special features in the underlying laws of the universe that seem to be necessary in order for life and hence conscious beings to exist. Change any one of them and the consequences would be lethal. Fred Hoyle, the distinguished cosmologist, once said that it was as if, quote, a superintellect has monkeyed with physics. Davies continues, to see the problem, imagine playing God with the cosmos. Before you is a designer machine that lets you tinker with the basics of physics. Twiddle this knob and you make all electrons a bit lighter. Twiddle that one and you make gravity a bit stronger, and so on. It happens that you need to set 30-something knobs to fully describe the world about us. The crucial point is that some of those metaphorical knobs must be tuned very precisely or the universe would be sterile. Example, neutrons are just a tad heavier than protons. If it were the other way around, atoms couldn't exist because all the protons in the universe would have decayed into neutrons shortly after the Big Bang. No protons, then no atomic nuclei, and no atoms. No atoms, no chemistry, no life. Like baby bear's porridge in the story of Goldilocks, the universe seems to be just right for life.
Wow.
So the point is, like, why bring this up with evolution? Well, the point is if there's nothing wrong with the idea of just God front loading all the design right at the beginning, right? And then everything just unfurling through natural processes after that. So I think that what's useful about the discovery of the fine tuning of physics is we can just kind of like take our hands off the evolutionary debate entirely and not get bogged down in what often it tends to be a very hostile and emotional subject for people. And like let's look at the and like the funny thing is about like there's even just a general sense, like the fact that we live, forget the fine tuning and just realize the fact that we live in a generally intelligible, orderly, and stable universe at all is incredibly surprising, right? Why don't we just live in a universe that's just sort of winking chaos all the time? Why is it that we have this rich physical structure, this stability, this order, this intelligibility? And that's something that people have recognized through all of time before physics, right? Like that, it's something we all take for granted. But why is that the case? And of course, we would argue that the best explanation for that is that there's an intelligent, ordering mind behind the cosmos. And physics is just really getting into some of the really interesting details now that further supports this conclusion.
And I think his second part to that question is kind of the crux of the matter as far as why it's such a hot debated issue is about man. Like,
right.
Are we or are we not created in the image and likeness of God? Is there something special about man? Does evolution explain man, in our entirety? And so that's, I'd love for you to tackle that.
Yeah. So the answer here is actually no. No, it doesn't. Not in our entirety. And the reason for this is something we'll get into the next question about consciousness. Humans have a rational, immaterial soul. So it's in principle impossible for a purely physical process to generate a transphysical effect. So the key here is if we can argue that there's some aspect of human beings that is not reducible to the purely physical, and I think we can argue that, and we will argue that here in a minute, then the evolutionary account is in some sense incomplete, right? There has to be something else about it. Now, we can accept the evolutionary account in and of itself. We just have to say, no, there's something missing here as a purely physical process that cannot fully or adequately explain human beings in and of themselves. Maybe... and there's lots of different ways that theologians and philosophers think about this. Maybe evolution got us to a certain degree of material complexity where God could then just directly infuse a transphysical rational soul. There's nothing wrong with that hypothesis. So there's lots of paths of possible reconciliation. But the general point is, no, evolution is a purely physical process, cannot fully explain humanity, specifically our rational animality.
Yeah. Well, then let's dive into question number 4. Is human consciousness a creation of the brain, or is it separate and a part of the brain? Brain, mind, consciousness, duality.
Right.
And I loved you actually explained that when you shared your story weeks ago on my podcast. And but I loved it. I would love for you to tackle this one because this is a big one. Actually, this is a big one.
Yeah, and I think overwhelmingly we can see that there's some aspect about us that is not material. And let me just give a couple different sketches of arguments. And if people want a little more depth, they can go to the document and also revisit our first conversation. The first one is the principle of identity argument, right? That if our thoughts, our mind, right? But most people think thoughts and ideas, if they're identical to just brain states, right? If A equals B, then I should never be able to see A or be directly aware of A without also being aware of B. So think of a coin, right? If I want to say that the heads of the coin just is the tails of the coin, then anything I do to the heads, or if I'm directly aware of the heads, I do to the tails and I'm directly aware of the tails. But clearly this isn't the case. Like I can scratch the heads of the coin without scratching the tails of the coin. I can see the heads of the coin without seeing the tails of the coin. So they're not the same thing. Now, I think this analogy is important because they might be two sides of the same coin. They might be connected, but they're not identical, right? And I think most people we see this as a simple principle of identity. Well, I would argue that the mind and the brain is something like that. I am directly aware of my thoughts, my ideas, right? And like that's the thing I am most directly aware of. But I have no awareness whatsoever of axons firing in my brain at all. And the reverse is also true, right? That if we look at the brain neuroscientifically from a third person perspective, and we just sort of map the brain from a scientific perspective, and we look at all the neural structures and the neurochemical interactions, we have no idea, first off, what somebody is thinking, what somebody is thinking, but even more so that somebody is thinking, that there's a first person self-reflective active understanding somehow associated with, connected, or correlated with those, neurochemical interactions in the brain, axons firing. And the only reason we do that, and the only reason we can draw certain correlations between brain states and thoughts, is because we are conscious beings. We experience consciousness directly, and we infer that other people are like us, for example. So we can map correlations, but we cannot map identity, and that is the critical key. And through various philosophical thought experiments like this, we can see, okay, that they seem to be very much connected. They seem to be very much correlated, but they're not identical. They're not, A does not equal B. There's something about our act of consciousness and specifically thinking, and I would even go far, powers of abstraction, the ability to grasp propositions, mathematical truths, heuristic notions that cannot be reduced to purely physical processes alone. So that's one way to think about it. The other way is through a sketch. It's the problem of what's sometimes called the qualitative abyss, right? And then just think about it like this, right? If everything at bottom is supposed to be some physical simple, whatever that is, maybe it's a fundamental particle, maybe it's something else, that doesn't matter. But your commitment, say as a naturalist, is that whatever this physical simple is, it's disparate, it's unconscious, it's unaware, it's undirected, all these different things, right? It's just kind of like a dumb, simple physical thing. This is an assumption of most atheist philosophers who are naturalists. Well, then we have a really big problem, right? Because how do you take something like that and through just time and chance alone affect a not just a quantitative change, right, in structure and arrangement, but a qualitative change? How do you take something that is disparate, that's not unified, that's not conscious, that's not aware, that's not directed, that's not intentional, and flip it into its perfect qualitative opposite, something that is inherently unified, something that is conscious, aware, directed at its objects, intentional? And that just seems like an absolute illogical impossibility. And we can see this. Most of us always recognize this with basic examples, right? If I have just a bunch of white Lego blocks, I can, with enough time and chance, maybe arrange them in complex and interesting ways. But I can never get a purple tower out of only white Lego blocks. I need something else to affect that qualitative, not just quantitative change. And I think what's interesting to realize is that many atheists and naturalistic philosophers recognize this problem. This isn't a problem that just theists point out. But what they do is they take a different track, right? What they do is they say, oh yeah, this is definitely a problem. You can't get consciousness out of these starting points. So what we'll do is we'll just deny that consciousness exists, right? And this is a position known as eliminativism in philosophy of mind. So they see the problem, right? They recognize it. Like a lot of theists and atheists are in agreement that this is a problem. But what they do is rather than revise their starting point, which I think is the right thing to do, they just consistently drive to an absurd conclusion. But as sure as anything, consciousness exists. And to even gather the type of data I would need to make any type of argument against consciousness, it has to come through my conscious acts of awareness, first of all.
Wow.
Right? And to say that consciousness doesn't exist or that it's an illusion just simply pushes the mystery back a stage, right? Wait, who is this an illusion for? Who's having the illusion that is apparently consciousness? I think the fact that the eliminativist position exists among secular and atheist philosophers is very telling. One, it shows how big of a problem this is and how many people recognize this problem, but how the solution isn't to go to absurdities. The solution is just to revise your starting point and say, okay, yeah, there must be more to reality than just dumb physical particulars. And certainly if we have mind at the foundation, if we have a qualitatively infinite being, right, that could impart existence in ways that reflects himself in many ways, being a conscious being, then we have the qualitative categories on hand to make sense of how consciousness can exist. It might still be a big mystery, and it is exactly how all that is worked out, but it doesn't seem like an impossibility anymore. And that, I think, is really important.
Yeah, and I think that really kind of answers the next question too, but I don't know if you want to add to this. And the next question number 5 is there a spiritual reality to our existence, or does the material physical alone explain our ultimate reality?
Yeah, there definitely is. And let me just go back to the 2 points in a document that I think are worth highlighting too. Because we haven't even gotten to the scientific evidence yet. We're still just purely philosophical right now. And one other quick sketch is that we can understand essences and universals, right? And there seems to be an incompatibility between our ability to understand universals like triangularity or circularity or things like that. And the fact that anything that is material is always particular. It's always this triangle or that circle. It's never triangularity as such, right? So if all of our thoughts are the result of particular physical brain states, it seems like our whole ability to abstract and understand universals would be impossible. But it's not impossible. We have that ability. Therefore, there seems to be something about the mind that is immaterial, that's not reducible to the physical in particular. Again, very general sketch there, but that's another path people can take. But very interestingly, and I think this is a scientific evidence, where we now have, to my mind, a pretty overwhelming amount of cases of what are called near-death experiences. And not just, and like, let me emphasize here, when we're about to talk about this, we're not talking about a book that somebody pulls out of the discount bin at Barnes & Noble's on like New Age, right? That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about peer-reviewed medical studies published in top medical journals like The Lancet of people that experience clinical death, like flat EEG, fixed and dilated pupils, and have sensorial knowledge, sense perception when they are clinically dead. Brain dead, right? Just like virtually no activity in the brain at all. Now, this is really interesting for a couple of reasons. And I think this is strong evidence, scientific evidence, that the soul really is transphysical. One is that the fact that anybody has any experiences at all when they shouldn't be from a sort of naturalistic perspective, if you just think that all of this is the result of the brain, is, I think, weight in the scale for a transphysical soul. But we can go further than that, because it's not just that they're having experiences. They have experiences which are veridical, which means that they're experiences that can be investigated by independent researchers of things that are really happening in the world. They're not just private hallucinations. That's the key thing. So you have these experiences where people can explain what's going on in the operating room, for example, or they can go through walls and listen in on conversations that other people are having, or they can like go outside of the hospital and see, like, there's cases where somebody will find like a shoe on a ledge that nobody else would see, and then later the investigators go out and they're like, oh no, wow, that shoe really is there, and they describe it exactly as it is. So the fact that they're having experiences is one thing, but also that these experiences, many of them are veridical, that they're later verified by independent investigators to be things that were really happening in the mind independent objective reality, I think ruins any chance of a naturalistic explanation of hallucinations or just the brain being oxygen deprived or any of that, because hallucinations don't produce veridical experiences. That's the key. Furthermore, there's really and I forget if I put this one in the document or not, but this one really blew my mind when I found it, that they've done research on near-death experiences of people who are blind, many of them congenitally blind, and they see for the first time.
What?
In these, isn't that crazy?
Wow.
And many of them have never had any sight ever. Right. So how you try to explain that from a purely naturalistic standpoint, I don't think it can be done. I really don't think it can be done. And there really are no adequate explanations for this now. And many of the people, so like Raymond Moody is a big researcher. I believe he went into this research as sort of an agnostic psychologist. And now he's completely convinced, right? That whatever, I don't know if he's affiliated with any religion, but he's convinced, that the human soul survives bodily death, that this life is not all there is. There is a spiritual aspect. So the people who are most relevant in this research, like Raymond Moody, their conclusions are relevant. They're interesting, and that is where he's at. But even if that weren't, I think when we just look at the experiences and we try to think, well, what could possibly explain this? And we just run through the possible naturalistic options, none of them come close to being able to offer any type of adequate explanation. And then on top of the philosophical arguments, this is just kind of what we would expect, right? Like we would expect that this might be the case. And so we have that additional evidence as a layer of support.
Yeah, and so, as Catholics, just a quick point is we can, like you said, we can believe in evolution, but at some point we have to affirm that God does intervene to create man's rational soul and give him that image and likeness to God. Yeah, and if you want to add anything, I think that actually flows well to the next question as well, which is kind of cool that this is flowing so well. But question number 6 is, what happens after we die? Is it eternal annihilation? We just no longer exist? Or do we continue to exist in some form, spiritual or consciousness? Yeah, once again, I don't know if there's anything you want to...
Yeah, I think we pretty much answered that. I guess the only thing I would add to that is if you think that there's good reasons to accept the revelation of Jesus Christ, that just adds an extra layer of support, right? And I do think, right. I know that we're not supposed to refer to a holy book. I would just say that there are good reasons to believe that the resurrection of Christ really did occur, historical reasons, theological reasons, philosophical reasons. And if you think that's the case, and that the resurrection is something that God himself revealed, then we have additional evidence, I think very good evidence, that very much jives with the philosophical arguments and what we see in near-death experiences. So yeah. I would just...
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Question number 7. What will be the end of the universe? Eternal expansion to nothingness?
So the kind of funny thing here is, the sort of consensus of modern cosmology is that, the second law of thermodynamics, usable energy is running down. And so eventually all matter will collapse and the universe will just expand forever, lifelessly into the void, if you will. Wow. And, yeah, isn't that exciting? And but there's good news, right? Like if we already have independent reason to believe that God exists, and that the universe is not all there is, that isn't and shouldn't be like a terrifying thing, right? Especially as Catholics, we believe that that this life is not the only life, and that God is bound to renew creation. That's a theological layer or theological add-on, but I think we have good reasons to accept that. However, I think it is alarming and startling if you're a naturalist, because it really is kind of nihilistic, isn't it? And many atheists have realized this, that look, if everything ends inevitably the same way, like there's no way to avoid this. Like there's just no feasible way that this isn't going to be the case. Now it's very, very long out, right? We got plenty of time, but it really means that we can't make any type of real difference in the end, no matter what we do, no matter how much environmental conservation, any of it, right? It all ends in the same way, in this thermodynamic heat death. They call it the heat death of the universe. So it has made many philosophers kind of just shrug their shoulders who are atheists and say, well, what's the point? It's all absurd. It's all ultimately for absolutely no, like even collectively, like obviously individually, if they don't believe in life after that, they think that's one point of possible despair. But even collectively, it's all for nothing and all ends the same way. And I think that invites many atheistic thinkers to nihilism. It brought me there when I was this was an alarming fact to me. Like, okay, it's one thing that I'm personally maybe going to go out of existence forever, but it's another thing to think that anything I do that has any contribution is eventually just going to be completely snuffed out and erased by this collapse of matter. And you're like, that's very depressing. Like that's very, very sad, I think. But the good news is that you shouldn't accept that. Right? The good news is that God exists. He loves you, and that this universe is more than there's more to life. We should say there's more to existence than just this universe. You don't need to be despairing over this, but that is the general scientific view.
Yeah,
right?
And just one quick comment, and I know Chuck's brother Robert may be disappointed, but I'm going to bring in a little that faith aspect in it on this one, and just say I take great solace in the judgment seat of Christ. He is a merciful judge, but we will give an account for our lives, and that packs our lives with meaning. Every moment matters. Every word we speak matters. Every action we do matters. Like, and what a beautiful thing. Like, it actually does have meaning. We actually, everything that we do matters. And so I think that's a really important thing. And we have a reasonable hope to believe that there will be some sort of existence. Like we already talked about the scientific evidence, and we have reason to believe that God exists. So we have a reasonable hope that if God created us, well, gosh, he didn't just do it for nothing. And then there's some sort of ultimate purpose. And if we do have that trans-physical soul, then why not? Like, why not have a reality or an experience after things are said and done where we live on and we continue to enjoy our Creator? So just a quick comment there.
And again, I just want to emphasize, like, faith is extremely relevant when you have good reasons to be a person of faith, right?
Right.
And I just want to emphasize, because I know a lot of people think it's like faith or reason. And I know we're trying to answer these questions just come from more of a philosophical and scientific standpoint, which is totally fair. And I hope that we've given decent responses to these from that.
Yeah.
But I just want to say, like, don't just like write off faith, right? Because like that is the next, or concurrent step in this journey when you see the harmony between the two. Because there are questions that, philosophy eventually stalls out, science eventually stalls out. And there are questions that can only be answered, I think, when you go to divine revelation. Mm-hmm. But where science and philosophy get you is they get you to a point where it's reasonable to accept that divine revelation, right?
Exactly.
And I think that's worth emphasizing.
What I love is that, philosophy and reason and science really works from the ground up, starting with experiences, and we go to that metaphysical reality of God's existence. And then faith works from the top down, starting with the innermost being of God, Trinity, and he reveals that. He reveals his innermost being to us through the person of Jesus Christ. And so faith comes down, reason goes up, and they meet, and they're never in contradiction. If there is a contradiction, like I think you've said before, then either there's a flaw in our thinking or a flaw in our faith. And so, because all truth ultimately comes from that one cause of existence, God, and he can't contradict himself.
Right. Yeah. So good stuff. Are we doing the bonus question now?
We're doing the bonus question.
All right. This was a fun one. I like this.
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. Bonus question. What is a black hole? And what is the eventual end to a black hole?
Yeah, so my response here is probably not going to be deeply satisfying, but I think we can draw out a good principle is honestly your guess is as good as mine too. Right? What I know about black holes is I think they're awesome. I think it's especially when they somehow got that photograph of that black hole fairly recently. Do you remember seeing that? And
I didn't see that.
That was so cool. But here's what I wanted to emphasize with something like this. And obviously black holes are very much debated in the scientific community as well. But much of life is a mystery, right? There's so much about life that is mysterious and that we have questions about. But don't let mysteries and questions be causes of doubt. Mysteries and questions are not necessarily objections. They're just mysteries and questions. If you ask me, like, why did God create black holes? I'll say, I really don't know. I don't know. Maybe because he thought they're interesting to look at, right? Or something. There's probably a better reason than that. But my honest answer is I have no idea. But here's the principle. Always look at what is unclear in light of what is clear. I'm not sure why God created black holes, but I have really good reasons to believe that God exists. And I have really good reasons to believe that God is omnipotent and omniscient. And so I think I have really good reasons to think that for whatever reason God created black holes, there's some reason for why God created black holes. And even though it might be a mystery, whatever that reason is, it's a question that isn't a cause for doubt, right? That isn't a reason to sort of to allow, an undermining of your faith. And in fact, so much of life is mysterious and there's so many questions. And I think that that's a good thing. I think it promotes our own flourishing, right? God made us rational animals. It seems like there's something really good in engaging with our world and coming to discover and learn about our world, to gather that intelligibility of our cosmos, both philosophically and scientifically. And the scientists come out of the Catholic worldview. I mean, many people have argued that there's a reason the sciences developed when and where they did, in light of Catholic civilization, right? Because we believe that the world is intelligible, that it's orderly, that we can understand it, right? So that makes sense that it jives with the Catholic worldview. And there's something good about that. There's something good about the sciences and the philosophy and learning and understanding and discovery and patience and exploration. So I would say, yeah, in all honesty, I have no idea. I am not a scientist of black holes. I don't even want to pretend to be. But we have really great reasons and evidence to believe in God's existence, and that God, when he creates, has a reason for everything he does. So we have good reason to think that there's reasons for black holes, but your guess is as good as mine. So I apologize if that's an unsatisfying answer, but I think the principle there of always looking at what is unclear in light of what is clear can be very helpful in life. So that way you don't start doubting things that shouldn't or don't need to be doubted.
Yes. Well, shout out to Chuck and Robert. Hopefully, hopefully these were satisfying answers for you all, and, and for everyone else listening, and, let the dialogue continue. Keep searching for truth, keep discovering, don't give up there. And so,
would you mind, Eric, maybe if we just gave some book recommendations? Cause,
yeah, for sure.
Because, obviously on a podcast, you can only just give kind of an initial introduction, but,
right.
And like I said, you seem really sincere, and I want to make sure that we give, as much attention to these as they're due. So, just to recommend a few books, if you're interested in, sort of philosophical arguments for God, I would start with maybe something like 5 Proofs of the Existence of God by Dr. Ed Feser. That's a really good one. And he'll take you through 5 different, philosophical arguments, Aristotelian, Neoplatonic, Thomistic, Leibnizian, and Augustinian. Also, what would be another good starting one for that? Father Norris Clark's The One and the Many is a really nice introduction to metaphysics in general. And then at the end of that book, he's got a series of different philosophical arguments for God. So those would be some good 2 kind of starting points. I also always like to point back to C.S. Lewis, who's very popular, but I think for good reason. I think his book Miracles, which is most people talk about mere Christianity, which is excellent. But if you want more of a philosophical treatment of theism, I would recommend his book Miracles as well. So Eric, anything you want to throw into the mix there?
Honestly, I love this encyclical by St. John Paul II, Fides et Ratio, just to get an overarching understanding of what faith actually is and what reason is, and how they don't combat each other, but they work in harmony with one another. So I do love that, and it's very short too. And I know it's coming from a religious person's perspective, but he uses such good reason, and it's just a good overview. You should never reject someone else's belief, right, unless you adequately understand that belief first. And so Don't reject the notion of faith without understanding what faith actually is, because there is that misconception of blind faith, which is something we don't believe in. We do believe in faith, like we said, surpassing reason, going above reason, but not against reason. And so I would just recommend that as just a foundational, text to understand the balance and the harmony between faith and reason.
Right. Awesome. Oh, one more by my friend Dr. Josh Rasmussen. It's called How Reason Can Lead to God. That's a really great, accessible, but still, I think, quite rigorous introduction. And it covers a number of different arguments, contingency arguments, arguments from consciousness. So if you enjoyed some of the topics we talked about in this episode, grab How Reason Can Lead to God by Dr. Josh Rasmussen.
That's great. All right. Well, any last comments from you, Pat, and from me?
Yeah. First off, I will say again, this was really fun. I appreciate this. And Chuck and Chuck's brother, if you're listening, thank you. Honestly, this is good stuff. I really enjoyed engaging with these, and I hope in some way, whether in a small way or in a big way, that our discussion here has been helpful.
Yeah, awesome. And yeah, if you all like our Polypat episodes, and please review them, and please let us get some feedback. And and check out that document we're going to put on our websites. I think that'll just help kind of hone these things in for you all. And of course, the exploration continues, and check out those books as well. So, all right, well, thanks, Pat, and thanks everyone for listening.
Always a pleasure, Eric. Thank you.
Yep.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.